Just 7 minutes ago, two of the monarchy's most disciplined and respected figures did something almost no one inside the palace believed could happen. Princess Anne and Prince Edward stepped into the king's private council chamber together, placed a signed declaration before Charles, and officially demanded that Camilla be stripped of her authority over royal household appointments, private estate access, and ceremonial planning. This wasn't simply a warning, it marked the beginning of what could become the biggest internal royal uprising in decades. Before we take a closer look at what this could mean for the future of the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another update. Charles fixed his eyes on the first page as silence settled across the room. His hand stopped halfway down before he slowly removed his glasses, and observed with quiet concern while Edward stood beside her, composed but determined. The Windsor Household Restoration Declaration, a formal proposal intended to restore balance inside the royal household, called for Camilla to surrender control over senior appointments, restricted estate records, and ceremonial planning. Those responsibilities would temporarily shift to a council led by the Princess Royal, while Edward would ensure every directive was properly carried out. The move affected far more than family relationships. It challenged the palace's chain of command while the monarch still occupied the throne. Charles immediately recognized how serious the consequences could be. These were not outside critics. They were his own sister and brother, united with him through both family and lifelong duty. Camilla reacted the moment a recorded message from the council secretary confirmed that the declaration had officially entered the private council record, the archive where major royal decisions are preserved. She pushed her chair back so forcefully that it scraped across the floor. Her surprise quickly became anger when she discovered Edward's signature beneath Anne's. Opposition from the king's sister had been expected, but not from the usually reserved younger brother, and refused to soften what came next. Sealed appendices, confidential attachments containing supporting material, listed disputed appointments, revised guest lists, blocked archive requests, and instructions issued without full consultation. She informed Charles that no explanations would be given until he had carefully read every page. Edward then disclosed through a documented account that he and Anne had been meeting privately for 6 weeks without aides or palace staff. Their final agreement had been reached late at night at Windsor after lengthy discussions. Camilla rejected the temporary transfer of authority. During a recorded call with the king's private secretary, she insisted that both siblings meet her directly before Charles reached any decision. What had begun as a written declaration had now turned into a direct confrontation within the royal family. Camilla refused to accept the temporary transfer of authority. Through a recorded phone call with the king's private secretary, she insisted that both siblings meet her face-to-face before Charles made any ruling. What had started as a written declaration had now become a direct confrontation within the royal family. But before all 4 of them could gather in the same room, the palace had to confront a far more painful reality. This conflict had not been created by policy alone. It had grown from emotional wounds each of them had quietly carried for years. Behind the declaration stood 4 individuals connected by blood, duty, marriage, and years of carefully hidden resentment, and considered herself the guardian of her late mother's standards. Edward had spent decades avoiding palace disputes. Camilla believed she had earned her position through patience and perseverance. Charles stood between them, forced to decide whether protecting his wife would now come at the cost of dividing the family he had sworn to keep united, and carried that responsibility with unwavering determination. She believed royal service had to remain disciplined, impartial, and protected from personal influence. The crown, the institution itself, rather than any individual, could never be shaped by whoever happened to stand closest to the sovereign. Her position reflected the late Queen's belief that duty must always stand above emotion, even when loyalty to family made that responsibility painful. Edward's support changed everything. For years he had been known as the peacemaker, choosing calm discussion whenever others moved toward confrontation. His decision to stand beside his sister proved this movement was no longer driven by Anne's firm principles alone. It had become a warning delivered by 2 senior working royals, family members entrusted with carrying out official duties on behalf of the monarch. Camilla sat alone, reading Edward's signature again and again. Opposition from and had never surprised her, but seeing the younger brother's name beneath the declaration was something she had never expected. The disappointment slowly turned into humiliation because his support showed that doubt had spread well beyond a single relationship. She realized that years of courtesy had quietly concealed deep mistrust. Charles later confronted his sister during a private meeting with no aides present. He asked whether she truly understood what this action could do to his marriage. and calmly replied that she understood exactly what years of silence had already done to the monarchy. Her words struck deeply because she spoke not only as a senior royal, but as the sister who had known him longer than anyone else and had watched him carry the burden of public judgment throughout his life. Edward then disclosed through documented records that 2 charitable engagements under his supervision had been removed from the autumn schedule after objections from Camilla's office. He had never been consulted. Instead, a junior aide delivered the explanation, leaving him feeling overlooked inside the institution he had faithfully served, and warned that the issue reached far beyond Camilla herself. If one household could redirect appointments, archive access, and ceremonial planning without proper oversight, future royal spouses might eventually follow the same pattern. Charles slowly placed the declaration on the table before asking one final question. What was the exact moment when both of you decided there was no other choice? The siblings exchanged a silent glance. Although the declaration had been signed only 7 minutes earlier, its true beginning stretched back several weeks, to a Windsor ceremony where private tension transformed into an unforgettable insult. Every royal conflict has a moment that appears insignificant to outsiders but becomes impossible to forget for those who live through it. For Anne and Edward, that moment arrived during the Windsor Service of Continuity, a private ceremony honouring decades of family duty. A single altered seating card, one missing tribute, and one firm instruction from Camilla's office transformed what should have been a respectful occasion into the point of no return. From that day forward, the 2 siblings believed silence had become more dangerous than speaking out, and arrived at the ceremony convinced the program had already been finalized. Edward carried the memorial tribute their mother had personally approved before her passing. The Windsor Service of Continuity, a private royal event created to recognize senior family members who had taken on additional responsibilities during times of national uncertainty, was intended to celebrate loyalty, not reveal division. The king had already approved the final schedule, so neither sibling expected any last-minute changes after rehearsals. Edward sensed something was wrong only minutes before the ceremony began. His tribute had disappeared, while Anne's principal address had been reduced to just 90 seconds. Camilla's private secretary informed them that the revisions reflected the Queen Consort's final instructions, adding that she would not be available for discussion. The alteration carried enormous significance because it removed words approved by their late mother and diminished the roles of 2 senior working royals without Charles's visible approval, and stood quietly in the corridor holding the revised program card. She never raised a voice. She folded the card once, handed it back, and calmly said, "Then let the official record show who made this change." Her composure unsettled Edward more than anger ever could. He knew his sister had moved beyond frustration. She had reached a firm decision. After the ceremony ended, Edward entered the empty chapel alone, carrying the unused memorial speech. The tribute contained passages personally approved by the late Queen, making the removal deeply personal, and found him staring silently at the pages and immediately realized that the brother who had always chosen peace had finally reached his limit. That evening, Charles listened carefully as Edward privately asked why the tribute had been removed. The king appeared genuinely confused and requested the original program. His expression changed the moment he noticed his own approval mark beside the deleted section, confirming that the revisions had been made after he had already given consent, and then reviewed earlier schedules through a documented archive request. She uncovered 5 similar changes involving herself, Edward, Sophie, and Catherine. Every alteration appeared to follow the same administrative route connected to Camilla's household. At 12:18 a.m., the siblings met alone inside Windsor's private library, and placed the altered ceremony program on the table. Edward quietly laid down the unused memorial tribute beside it. Without saying much, both agreed to begin collecting every available record. Now those records rested before the king, and Camilla was walking toward the council chamber, fully prepared to defend every one of her decisions face to face. When Camilla entered the council chamber, no aides followed behind her. No private secretaries remained to soften the conversation, and no courtiers stood nearby to absorb the tension. Charles sat at the head of the table with the declaration resting beneath one hand, and remained standing, while Edward faced the window before slowly turning toward the Queen Consort. Then the door closed, and years of carefully controlled royal restraint gave way to the most direct family confrontation of the reign. Charles ordered that the meeting remain completely private. Only 4 voices would be heard, and no royal title would shield anyone from answering difficult questions. The declaration, a formal written request to restructure authority within the royal household, remained at the center of the table. Every disputed appointment, archive restriction, and ceremonial alteration now required a full explanation. Camilla defended her actions without hesitation. She argued that the royal schedule had become overcrowded, repetitive, and increasingly difficult to manage. Separate royal households, each operating independently, were creating confusion and placing additional pressure on the king. She insisted every decision had been made to protect Charles's time, reduce unnecessary conflict, and keep the monarchy functioning efficiently, and rejected that explanation immediately. She questioned why every effort toward modernization seemed to reduce the responsibilities of the same senior royals while steadily expanding Camilla's influence over ceremonies, staffing decisions, and official records. The Queen Consort described the accusation as deeply unfair, and calmly responded that the documents themselves were far more damaging than anything she had said aloud. Edward stepped forward and placed his unused memorial tribute on the table. He asked directly whether Camilla had personally approved its removal. At first, she answered that the ceremony required better balance. Edward repeated the question. After several moments of silence, she finally admitted authorizing the change but insisted she had not realized the speech contained words personally approved by their late mother. His expression hardened. Years of courtesy had finally given way to quiet disappointment, and then presented a written instruction stating that the Windsor revisions had been carried out with the sovereign's approval. Charles immediately denied giving any such authorization. Turning toward his wife, he asked why his authority had been used without his knowledge. For the first time during the meeting, Camilla lowered her eyes instead of answering immediately. According to a recorded account of the discussion, Camilla admitted she feared and Edward were creating an alternative center of influence built around the legacy of the late Queen. She believed they had never truly accepted her position and still viewed her as someone unworthy of helping shape the future of the reign. Charles slowly pushed the declaration toward the center of the table. Camilla reached forward to take it, but quietly rested 2 fingers on the folder first. Edward remained silent, watching every movement. The king ordered that every sealed appendix be reviewed before sunset. As the chamber door finally opened once again, the confrontation came to an end, but a far more serious struggle had only just begun, centered on records, loyalties, and the hidden authority behind the declaration. The declaration carried only 2 signatures, yet it could never have been created by just 2 people. Behind Anne and Edward stood a quiet network of archivists, household officials, program coordinators, and former palace staff, each preserving a small piece of the same troubling pattern. Their evidence gave the declaration its real strength, but it also exposed individuals who had risked their careers by placing the monarchy above personal loyalty. Edward understood better than most how influence truly operated inside the palace. It did not depend only on royal titles or public ceremonies. It moved through diaries, briefing papers, security clearances, event schedules, archive permissions, staffing recommendations, and confidential notes that determined whose voice reached the king first. He also knew that challenging Camilla without solid proof would appear to be nothing more than family resentment. For that reason, he and carefully built a complete chronological record. Every disputed decision was matched with its original approval, the later alteration, the official explanation, and the final authorizing name. One evening, after darkness had settled over the palace, a senior program coordinator met Edward privately and handed him a folder containing duplicate schedules. Her hands trembled as she admitted during a recorded conversation that she had been instructed to destroy earlier versions after revisions were made. Edward assured her that her identity would never appear inside the declaration before personally sealing the evidence. His calm offered reassurance, but the fear in her voice revealed just how serious the internal situation had become, and faced a different challenge. Alone in her office, she carefully reviewed the final appendix, a supporting section attached to the declaration, and discovered a personal note that could have publicly humiliated the Queen Consort without proving any actual misconduct. She quietly removed it. The Princess Royal wanted accountability, not revenge, believing that exposing private cruelty would only damage Charles's marriage while adding nothing meaningful to the case. The collected records also uncovered what appeared to be an informal pre-clearance system, where major proposals were quietly filtered through Camilla's household before ever reaching the sovereign. Requests could be delayed, rewritten, or quietly removed without any formal rejection. One staffing instruction even carried a digital approval code connected to Charles's office, yet the King's principal secretary later confirmed there was no evidence Charles had ever seen it. After reviewing the material, Charles acted without delay. He suspended the entire pre-clearance system and ordered that every future change involving senior working royals must reach him through two separate independent channels. Camilla received the decision in complete silence. Her only question was whether her husband had personally authorized it. When she was told that he had, she slowly lowered the page without saying another word. By sunset, the declaration had achieved its first major success. But inside Camilla's household, the suspension no longer felt like a routine review. It felt like the opening stage of her removal from the center of royal authority. The consequences arrived before the palace had any opportunity to prepare a public explanation. Meetings were cancelled, access permissions were suspended, and 3 senior staff members were instructed to hand over internal files while ceremonial planning for the coming month was placed under joint review. Yet the greatest shock was not administrative. It was deeply personal. Camilla returned to her private rooms and discovered that decisions once delivered directly to her desk were now being redirected elsewhere without consultation. Charles's suspension order shifted the balance of authority immediately. The order, a temporary royal instruction that would remain active until a complete review was finished, removed Camilla's household from final control over senior appointments, restricted estate records, and ceremonial amendments, and received temporary responsibility for heritage and archive matters, while Edward became responsible for reviewing every program change before approval. The palace quietly divided. Some courtiers believed authority had become too concentrated around one household and welcomed the review. Others feared and Edward had established a dangerous precedent by showing that coordinated family pressure could weaken the position of the sovereign spouse. Both sides understood the importance of the struggle. It was no longer testing only Camilla's influence. It was testing the limits of loyalty within the monarchy itself. Camilla truly felt the change when a red dispatch box arrived outside her office. The secure container, normally used to carry official royal documents, was collected only moments later by a palace clerk who politely apologized and explained that it had been reassigned elsewhere. Camilla quietly closed the door and remained standing beside it, stunned that influence built over many years could disappear within seconds without any public announcement. That evening, Charles entered their private sitting room. Camilla asked him a simple but painful question. "Do you still trust me?" The king answered that trust could not survive if his authority had been used without his knowledge. Camilla insisted every decision had been made only to protect him. Charles could hear the emotion in her voice, yet neither of them seemed able to bridge the growing distance between them. Meanwhile, Edward uncovered something even more troubling during the transfer of internal files. A private calendar listed several unrecorded meetings between Camilla's staff and estate trustees, including multiple gatherings held only days before Anne's archive requests had been rejected. Soon afterward, a deputy private secretary submitted a written resignation after being asked to explain the approval codes, suggesting the ongoing review might expose far more than altered schedules, and refused to celebrate the developments. When one courtier quietly congratulated her on winning the first stage of the struggle, she immediately replied that there could be no victory if Charles lost his marriage or if the crown lost the public's confidence. Close to midnight, Edward received a handwritten summons from the king. Expecting pressure to abandon the declaration, he entered Charles's private study. Instead, what the king placed before him would transform the entire conflict from a family disagreement into a decision about the future structure of the monarchy itself. There were no secretaries, legal advisors, or council officials inside the room. When Edward took his seat across from his brother, Charles had already removed his jacket and loosened his tie, looking far less like a monarch and far more like a man exhausted by the impossible weight of family loyalty. Resting between them were the declaration, the unused memorial speech, and a single unsigned order. The conflict had reached its decisive moment, not through raised voices, but through a quiet conversation between two brothers who could no longer hide behind royal protocol. Charles chose to meet Edward because moderation had always defined him, and would defend the declaration without hesitation, but Edward had spent most of his life avoiding confrontation. If even he continued to support the revolt after everything that had been uncovered, then the king knew the evidence could no longer be dismissed as simple family resentment. The unsigned order, a royal directive awaiting the monarch's approval, proposed a permanent restructuring of household authority. No single office would again hold exclusive control over appointments, archive access, or ceremonial changes. Instead, every major decision would require approval from the sovereign, the affected working royal, and an independent household official. Charles quietly asked whether Camilla was truly being punished. He questioned whether the declaration was really about governance, or whether years of unresolved resentment over his marriage had finally reached the surface. Edward answered through the recorded conversation that old wounds certainly remained, but he would never place his signature on a constitutional document simply to settle personal emotions. His response carried weight because he never denied the pain. He simply refused to allow that pain to become the reason for his actions. Edward then admitted that opposing Camilla had brought him no satisfaction. He remembered how isolated she had once appeared and how sincerely he had tried to make her feel accepted. His voice grew quieter as he explained that loyalty became impossible when simple courtesy was mistaken for silent agreement. Charles lowered his eyes because the truth extended far beyond a single ceremony. He admitted that he had noticed unusual schedule changes and unexpected staffing decisions over the years. Yet he had remained silent because challenging those actions could easily be interpreted as public doubt toward his own wife. By avoiding confrontation, he had unknowingly allowed authority to gather in places he no longer fully controlled. The king then asked Edward whether he would accept the new system if and step down from her temporary leadership role immediately. Edward answered without hesitation. His sister would gladly step aside, but only after the order had been officially signed and fully implemented. Charles slowly uncapped his fountain pen. After reading the document one final time, he signed it and gently slid it across the table. And was right, he quietly admitted. The monarchy cannot depend on private assurances, not even mine. He then asked Edward to bring and to the morning council while he personally informed Camilla of the decision. The institutional struggle had been settled in complete silence. But before the palace could begin moving forward, Charles still had to deliver the ruling that would permanently redefine Camilla's position beside the crown. The following morning, the palace woke to an atmosphere unlike any seen in years. Word of the king's signed order had quietly spread through private offices before any public announcement could be prepared. Senior officials arrived earlier than usual, conversations grew shorter, and every department waited for instructions that could reshape the future of the royal household. And entered the morning council without celebration. She understood that the order represented responsibility rather than victory. Edward walked beside her in silence, knowing that the difficult decisions were only beginning. Charles had already taken his place at the head of the table, the signed directive resting before him. The document no longer represented a proposal. It had become official royal policy awaiting implementation. The king opened the meeting by reminding everyone that the purpose of the reforms was not punishment, but accountability. The monarchy, he explained, could only preserve public confidence if authority remained transparent and properly supervised. Personal relationships, however important, could never replace institutional responsibility. The newly approved structure immediately introduced several major changes. Senior appointments would now require independent review before receiving royal approval. Archive access could no longer be restricted by a single household, while ceremonial planning would pass through multiple levels of oversight before reaching the sovereign. Every future decision involving senior working royals would be documented through a transparent approval process. Camilla received the official notice shortly afterward. She read every page carefully before placing the document back on her desk. For several moments she remained completely silent. Years of influence had been replaced by a system designed to prevent any single office from exercising the same level of control again. The reality was difficult to ignore. Across the palace, reactions remained divided. Some officials quietly believed the reforms would strengthen the monarchy by restoring balance and preventing future disputes. Others worried the changes exposed internal divisions that should never have reached this stage. Regardless of personal opinion, everyone understood that the institution had entered a completely new chapter. Later that afternoon, Charles met privately with Anne and Edward once more. There were no arguments, no raised voices, and no declarations left to sign. The king simply thanked both siblings for placing the institution above personal comfort, even though the process had deeply wounded the family, and answered calmly that protecting the crown had always required difficult choices. Edward added that no one inside the room had truly won. The only hope was that the monarchy itself would emerge stronger than before. As evening settled over Windsor, the palace slowly returned to its usual routine. Yet everyone understood that nothing was quite the same. The declaration signed only hours earlier had permanently changed the balance of authority inside the royal household, leaving a legacy that would shape future generations of the monarchy long after the meeting itself had ended. Inside the palace, implementation of the new system began immediately. Department heads received revised instructions, long-established procedures were suspended, and every major decision involving senior working royals was placed under additional review. Officials who had quietly watched events unfold now realized that the changes were no longer temporary discussions. They had become the monarchy's new reality, and approached her new responsibilities with the same discipline that had defined her public service for decades. She made it clear that every archive request, ceremonial amendment, and heritage matter would now follow established procedures without exception. Personal influence would no longer determine official decisions. Edward focused on reviewing future royal programs. Every proposed schedule passed through careful examination before reaching the king's desk. His goal was not to challenge individuals, but to ensure that transparency replaced uncertainty. Quietly, he began restoring confidence in a system that many believed had drifted away from proper oversight. Camilla remained largely out of public view during the first days following the reforms. Close advisors noticed a visible change in her routine as meetings became fewer and official papers no longer arrived with the same frequency. For the first time in years, many of the responsibilities once managed through her office had been reassigned elsewhere. Charles carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all. While he believed the reforms were necessary, he also understood the personal cost they had placed upon his marriage. Every decision had forced him to balance his role as sovereign against his role as husband, knowing that satisfying one responsibility often meant hurting the other. Across royal households, staff members quietly adjusted to the new structure. Communication channels were rewritten, approval procedures expanded, and long-standing administrative practices were carefully reviewed. Some welcomed the increased accountability, while others worried that the family divisions would remain long after the paperwork had been completed. Despite the tension, Anne never spoke publicly against Camilla. Edward followed the same approach. Both believed the purpose of the declaration had never been personal humiliation but institutional reform. Their objective, as they repeatedly explained in private discussions, had always been to protect the long-term stability of the monarchy. As the first week under the new system came to a close, one reality became impossible to ignore. The declaration that had begun as a confidential document inside the King's Council chamber had transformed the internal structure of the royal household. Whether history would remember it as an act of courage or a painful family conflict remained uncertain, but no one inside the palace doubted that it had permanently changed the course of the reign. Charles knew the reforms would be remembered long after the meetings had ended. They had reshaped more than internal procedures. They had redefined how authority would function inside the royal household for years to come. The declaration signed by Anne and Edward had begun as a private challenge, but it ultimately became a turning point in the history of the monarchy. Camilla gradually accepted that the structure surrounding her office had changed. While she remained queen consort, many of the responsibilities once managed directly through her household would now operate under independent oversight. The reforms did not remove her position, but they permanently altered the limits of her authority, and returned to her regular royal duties without seeking recognition. She believed the institution should always stand above individual personalities. Edward did the same, quietly continuing his responsibilities while ensuring that the newly approved procedures were properly followed. Neither sibling viewed the outcome as a personal victory. Their priority had always been protecting the long-term stability of the crown. Charles later reflected on the difficult choices that had brought the family to this point. He understood that leadership sometimes required decisions capable of causing personal pain in order to preserve institutional trust. The reforms had demanded sacrifices from everyone involved, including himself. Within palace corridors, daily life slowly returned to normal. Ceremonies continued, official engagements resumed, and royal schedules moved forward under the revised system. Yet those who worked inside the institution understood that an important chapter had quietly closed while another had just begun. Historians may one day debate whether the declaration represented courage, necessity, or the unavoidable result of years of internal tension. But few would deny its lasting impact. The events surrounding Edward, Charles, and Camilla demonstrated how fragile the balance between family loyalty and constitutional responsibility could become when both collided. For now, the monarchy moves forward under a new framework, one built on greater oversight, shared responsibility, and clearer accountability. Whether these changes ultimately strengthen the institution or create new challenges will only be answered with time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this update, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest royal family news and exclusive updates. We'll see you in the next video.